Kansas City, Missouri, January 1892. The streets were dead quiet, the whole West Bottoms buried under a biting winter storm. Wind howled through narrow alleys, rattling tired wooden signs and sweeping snow across the worn stone steps. A few faint oil lamps glowed behind frosted windows, their weak light swallowed almost instantly by the thick, black night and the shrieking wind. At the very end of the row, one small house stood with its door still unlatched. The window pane fogged over, the faint crackle of a fire inside breaking the silence. The woman sat there, knitting slowly, her hands moving out of habit while her eyes stared into the flames. Her face was sharp, her expression calm, but her posture carried the quiet fatigue of someone who'd been alone for far too long. A storm like this was nothing new in Kansas City. Nights like this, Mrs. Whitfield never expected anyone to knock, never hoped for anyone to call. But tonight, with the blizzard still raging outside, came the sound of knocking. At first soft, like a stray branch, then louder, more urgent, until it thudded heavy and desperate against the door. Mary's head lifted. The ball of yarn slipped from her fingers and rolled to the floor. Out there was only storm, cold, white, and dark. No one had any business being out in that. Another knock, heavier now, like whoever it was had no strength left to keep knocking much longer. Mary stood, reaching for the shawl hanging by the door, and moved toward the sound, her stomach tightening with a quiet, wordless unease. Her hand paused on the latch as the wind outside screamed, whipping the hem of her dress. Who was on the other side of that door? And what waited for her? The door creaked open, and the wind lunged in as if trying to rip the little house apart. Mary stood in the doorway, her skirt and hair whipping backward, eyes squinting against the stinging snow. The man stood there, looking as if he'd stepped straight out of a nightmare. Thin, soaked through, his boots falling apart, hat lost somewhere, hair crusted with ice. In his arms, wrapped in a thin, threadbare blanket, was a baby. The child's breath came faint and shallow, a weak puff of white in the frozen air. Its tiny fingers were stiff, its lips a worrying shade of blue. Mary froze, her hand still gripping the latch. The wind slammed against her back, rattling the curtain inside, making the fire in the stove crackle and hiss. The man lifted the baby a little higher, his voice hoarse and trembling, no more than a broken whisper. "Milk. Please, just some milk. For him." Those last 3 words, "for him," struck something inside Mary, something colder and deeper than the storm outside. She looked at the baby again, so small, barely more than a breath, shivering weakly in that thin blanket, and she knew she couldn't just stand there. "Come in," she said quietly, pulling the door open wider. "Don't let him freeze to death out. Here!" He stepped inside, as though his legs barely remembered how to carry him. Mary pushed the door shut and bolted it. Instantly, the house seemed to sigh, holding on to what little warmth it had, while the storm outside continued to scream against the roof. She motioned for him to sit by the fire. He sank into the chair like a sack of wet hay, hands trembling, still clutching the baby as though it were the last fragile thing keeping him alive. She knelt, gently prying the baby from his arms. For the first time he reacted, just a sharp breath, like he was afraid to let go. But his eyes were clouded, and his fingers finally, reluctantly released their grip. The baby was cold enough to make Mary's hands ache. She held it close to her chest, wrapped another shawl around it, rubbed its tiny hands, and soothed it softly. "Hush. There, little one. Hush now." He sat motionless in the weak firelight, his gaze locked on the baby as though trying to memorize each fragile breath. His shoulders shook, though it was impossible to say if it was from the cold, exhaustion, or something deeper. Mary didn't ask any questions. She rose, moving quickly to the kitchen, fetching the pot of milk she kept warm every night. Carefully, she poured a little into a spoon and pressed it to the baby's lips, watching it swallow the first drops. The child breathed more steadily then, eyelids fluttering closed. The room fell silent except for the storm howling beyond the walls and the faint crackle of the fire. Mary didn't look at him, but she could feel his eyes on her, the eyes of a man lost, grateful, ashamed, and afraid to believe he deserved what he was seeing. After a long while, Mary finally spoke, her voice barely above the wind outside. "What's your name?" "Charles," he said slowly, his voice cracking. "Charles Walker." She nodded once, then lowered her gaze back to the baby, spooning another sip of milk and gently rocking it in her arms. Neither of them said much else that night. The firelight flickered on the worn wooden walls, casting long shadows of a weary man, a fragile infant, and a woman holding tight to the last bit of warmth left in the long night. Outside, the storm raged on, and Mary knew the night had only just begun. The night stretched long, heavy with the silence of the storm. Mary sat on a low stool near the fire, the baby curled in her arms, its faint warmth like a tiny ember clinging on in the white roar outside. Its eyelids drooped, its cheeks already a little pink from the warm milk and clean blankets, but its little hand still lay limp, barely clutching at the edge of her wool sweater. She studied its face as if trying to etch every fragile breath into her memory. And before she realized it, her thoughts drifted to another night, equally cold, equally full of screaming wind, equally heavy with the weight of a child in her arms. Her son. Henry. Henry hadn't yet turned 2 when the fever took him. That night, she had held him just like this, brushing his hair back, whispering, "It'll be all right," just as she was whispering now to this stranger's baby. But Henry never woke again. Her hand tightened around the infant just slightly, then eased. She took in a slow breath, forcing down the ache she thought she'd buried years ago. Across the room, Charles sat motionless on the bench, his gaze distant, sometimes flicking toward the baby, and then away again, as if he couldn't bear to look for too long. His head was buried in his hands, fingers splayed across his forehead. In the firelight, his hollow face revealed every cut, every bruise, every twitch of muscle along his temple. After a while, he finally spoke, voice low and frayed. I didn't mean to have him." Mary didn't look up. She kept spooning warm milk into the baby's tiny mouth, watching its lips move faintly. "I didn't want—" He stopped, his voice catching. "He doesn't deserve what I've already done to him. I don't know how to be a father." Mary stayed quiet, then after a few moments replied softly, "No one does." Not at first. Charles let out a bitter, breathless laugh, his eyes narrowing like he was holding back tears. "You say that because you don't know. I'm not the kind of man who should have a kid. I've been in jail. I worked for bastards on the railroad, breaking people's legs for $1. He stopped, exhaled, and slumped back against the wall. "His mother, she died giving birth. And I thought about leaving him. For weeks, I couldn't even look at him. Then, tonight, when he cried, Mary finally turned her head and looked directly at him. Her eyes were calm, not judging, but not soft either. "You brought him here," she said evenly. "That means you care more than you think." Charles dropped his gaze, as if her words had cut deep. His hand trembled, opening and closing on his knee, but he said nothing more. Mary lowered her eyes to the baby and pressed a kiss to its warm forehead. The faint scent of milk and sweat rose up, and it stabbed at something inside her chest. Henry. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. Not Henry. This wasn't her child, but it still needed to be held, still needed someone to keep it safe. She murmured softly. Sleep now, little one. Sleep. Outside, the wind screamed again, rattling the window panes, snow piling thicker and thicker. In the little house, the shadow of the storm hung heavy over the room. But the faint warmth of the child in her arms clung on, a fragile thread holding everything together. And Mary knew the night was far from over. But at least, it wasn't empty anymore. By morning the storm had eased, though the sky hung low and gray, as if warning that winter's anger wasn't yet spent. Snow still rose to their knees, the streets quiet save for the scrape of shovels and the occasional slam of a wooden door. Mary stood on the porch, the baby wrapped snug in her arms, sleeping soundly. Charles hovered just behind her, his shoulders hunched, gaze fixed on the floorboards like a guilty man. At dawn he'd meant to leave, but Mary had only said, "Take the child first." So he stayed, letting her walk out ahead. When she opened the door, the cold whipped through, carrying with it the weight of her neighbor's eyes. Eleanor Briggs, from the house next door, was already there, arms crossed, her stare sharp enough to cut. "Well, Whitfield," she said, her voice pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. "You've gone and taken in a drifter now? I thought you'd learned something after what happened to your boy." Mary stood still, clutching the child closer, feeling it stir faintly in her arms. "The child isn't to blame," she replied calmly, without looking at her. Eleanor sniffed, her eyes darting to Charles, who lingered by the doorway, trying to disappear into himself. She lowered her voice just enough, but still loud enough for the block to hear. "Some good-for-nothing bastard sires a child out of wedlock with some tramp, leaves her to die, and now he drags the brat here? You're a fool, Mary. You really are." Charles heard every word. His jaw tightened, his head dropped lower, his fist clenched. "Come on," Mary said simply, and she stepped off the porch, her boots crunching in the snow. Charles followed, still too ashamed to look up at anyone. The whole street watched them. Men, women, even children peered through curtains or stood on stoops, their eyes following every step, part curiosity, part disgust, part waiting to see just how far Whitfield would go with this half-mad decision. At the far end of the street stood the little church, its door propped open to welcome those still seeking shelter. Reverend Samuel Cole stood on the steps, his black cloak dusted with snow. As he saw them approach, he frowned slightly, then came forward. "Mary," he called softly. "You don't have to—" "She needs the warmth," Mary interrupted, her eyes fixed straight ahead, still cradling the baby. Reverend Cole looked at Charles, then back at Mary. His lips pressed into a line as though he wanted to say something more, but he only nodded and stepped aside to let them in. Inside, the heat from dozens of candles softened the chill. Charles slumped against the back wall, his eyes red-rimmed and empty. Mary sat the baby on a bench by the stove, checked its breathing, adjusted its blankets. After a while, Reverend Cole came over, speaking low so others wouldn't hear. "They don't understand, but you know what they'll say. You're only making trouble for yourself." Mary didn't look up. She stroked the baby's tiny hand and let the faintest smile cross her face. "The child isn't to blame," she whispered. Reverend Cole sighed, then turned away. In his tired, old eyes, he knew there was no swaying a heart that had already chosen the right thing, no matter the cost. That night, Mary's little house was quieter than usual. Snow had started falling again, not as violently as the storm before, but colder, steadier, like 1,000 tiny blades sinking into the street. Charles sat on the bench, his head buried in his hands, breathing heavily. The fire still crackled in the stove, its light throwing his shadow, hunched and trembling, across the wall. The baby slept soundly in the cradle, its tiny breaths soft and steady, its face impossibly peaceful. Mary sat at the table, her knitting idle in her lap, watching him. She had seen that look before, the look of a man lost, torn between staying and fleeing, too afraid of what he might leave behind. Charles finally lifted his head, his eyes red and tired. I can't, he murmured. Mary didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. I can't be his father, he said, his voice cracking, his hands clenching into fists, then loosening. I'm not someone who should be here. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to care for him. I've got nothing. He deserves better. He glanced toward the cradle, his gaze shaky, then looked away. His whole body seemed to shrink, folding in on itself. Mrs. Briggs was right, he muttered. He'll suffer. If he stays with me, I'll only hurt him. Mary gripped the edge of her knitting. The heat from the stove felt faint now, as though even the fire couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in the room. She rose, walked to the cradle, and brushed her fingers through the baby's soft, thin hair. You brought him here, she said softly, still looking down at the baby. You saved him from the storm. You didn't leave him out there. That's not something a bad man does. Charles let out a bitter laugh, dry and hollow. Maybe, but I'm not good enough to keep him. He'd be better off if I left. Someone better would take care of him. Mary turned to him then, meeting his eyes, steady, unflinching but not cruel. You know who that someone is? She asked, her voice low. He didn't answer. No one, she said plainly. There's no one else. Don't wait for someone better, because that night, it was you who carried him here. The room fell quiet again. Charles stared at the baby, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes sank, heavy, and then he stood abruptly. Mary watched him, but didn't stop him. He grabbed his old coat, shoulders shivering as the cold air slapped his face when he opened the door. His hand gripped the handle, hesitating just a second before glancing back at the cradle. Then he stepped outside. Mary didn't move. She lowered herself, lifting the baby to her chest, pressing it close. Outside, his footsteps crunched faintly in the snow, fading into the wind. She murmured to the child, Tonight, it's just you and me, little one. The baby stirred in its blanket, nestling deeper into her warmth. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen streets, and the faint lights from distant houses blurred into the white. Mary stood there, staring at the door he'd left through, knowing all too well. His fear was colder than the storm. The next day, the sky was ashen, the snow had stopped, but the wind still cut like a knife. Mary had barely slept through the night. She sat by the cradle, keeping watch over the baby's shallow, uneven breaths. Its skin felt hot, its cheeks flushed deep red. By late morning, she wrapped it tight in blankets and stepped outside, making her way through the deep snow to the small clinic at the end of the street. The doctor shook his head, his voice flat. High fever. Keep him warm. Give him water, a little at a time. If he makes it through tonight, it'll be in God's hands. Mary gripped the bundle tighter. She didn't reply, only nodded and turned back into the wind. When she reached her porch, she froze. Charles was there, leaning against the doorway, his head bowed, his coat crusted with ice, hair wet and matted. He looked up as she approached. His eyes were swollen, red, hollow, but softer somehow, stripped of their old defenses. Mary didn't say a word. She only unlatched the door, carried the baby inside. He followed silently. The little house filled again with the faint warmth of the fire. Mary laid the baby in the cradle, adjusted the blankets, wiped his damp forehead with a cool cloth. Charles stood near, watching her hands work. Slow, steady, soothing. After a long silence, he finally spoke, barely above a whisper. I didn't know where else to go. I left, but I ended up back here. This was the only place. Mary stopped her hands, met his gaze. You don't owe me anything, she said evenly. Charles swallowed hard, his knuckles white against the edge of the chair. But don't leave him, she added. He needs his father more than anything else. He glanced at the baby, wrapped tight, breathing unevenly, its tiny fist curled weakly into the blanket. A long pause. Then, slowly, awkwardly, he reached down and for the first time placed his hand on the cradle. The baby stirred, cracked its eyes open, let out a faint sigh, and clutched at his finger. Charles took a breath, gripping that little hand gently, then murmured, You'll be okay. I promise. Mary watched their hands, one big, rough, and calloused, the other small and fragile, clasped together in the dim glow of the fire. She turned away, hiding the faintest smile. Outside, the wind still howled across the roof, sharp and cold, but inside the warmth began to creep back, and the chill seemed a little less harsh. She knew then. Tonight, he wouldn't leave again. That night, the second storm came, sudden and fiercer than before. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the wood, rattling the windows, snow hammering the roof like angry fists. Mary was no stranger to storms, but the baby's fever worried her more than any howling wind. Its breathing was heavy, its little body burning hot. She pressed cool cloths to its skin, wrapped and unwrapped it to adjust the heat, held it close to her chest to share her warmth, but still the heat radiated from him. Charles sat in the corner, watching in silence. He no longer avoided her eyes. Last night he'd wanted to leave. Now he just stared at the baby, his hands resting on his knees, his jaw set tight. At last, he stood and stepped closer to the cradle. Show me, he murmured, voice unsteady. Mary looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Show me, he said again. How to make him sleep, how to bring the fever down. I don't want to see him like this anymore. Mary nodded. She handed him the damp cloth and guided his hand to the baby's burning forehead. His touch was clumsy, but for the first time, his gaze was steady, his calloused fingers trembling as they moved gently over the child's skin, wiping him down. All through the night, they took turns. Charles rocked the baby, trying to coax him into sleep, awkwardly changing the cloths, fetching warm water. Sometimes he wrapped the blankets too tight or too loose, but Mary simply reached over to adjust them without a word, her expression patient. For the first time, when the baby clutched his finger, Charles smiled, just a small, shy smile, but real. The storm still howled outside, snow piled deeper, and the lamp flickered, but the little house no longer felt as cold. In the fragile warmth of the room, Mary saw something shift. He was still Charles Walker, thin, hollow-eyed, carrying the weight of his battered past. But tonight, in the way he held the baby, rubbed its back, whispered it to sleep. She saw the shape of a father. She turned her face away so he wouldn't see her smile. The baby's breathing grew even, its tiny face relaxing. Charles still held him, so gently, as though afraid he might wake. Mary leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes, feeling a quiet calm she hadn't felt in many nights. Outside, The storm raged on. But inside, she knew. This was just the first step, a trial he'd chosen to stay and face. By the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving Kansas City blanketed in silence and snow. The drifts reached the porch steps, and weak sunlight cut through the clouds in cold, silvery streaks. Mary cradled the sleeping baby in her arms as her eyes met Charles's. He stood at the window, staring out at the street. His shoulders trembled slightly, his hand gripping the window frame, his face torn with something he couldn't seem to name. All morning, he hadn't said a word. He just stood there, watching the neighbors outside shoveling snow, fixing roofs. Their glances at Mary's window still carried a quiet weight of judgment. At last, Charles turned back. His gaze fell on the baby, then on Mary. He drew a deep breath, his voice small but steady. "I have to go." Mary didn't look surprised. She just stood there, waiting for him to continue. He stepped closer to the table, his hands opening and closing, trembling as he said, "He deserves someone better than me. I don't want him growing up with someone like me." Mary held the baby a little tighter, then slowly laid him in the cradle. She faced Charles, her expression calm but piercing. "And who exactly do you think that better person is?" Charles froze, unable to answer. "No one," Mary said quietly. "No one better than his own father. Don't give yourself the excuse of leaving just because you're afraid. Being a father, it's not about being ready. It's about choosing to stay." He pressed his lips together, his fists clenching tight, his eyes red. At that moment, the door opened. A tall man in a police coat stepped inside. Seth Hayes, the neighborhood constable. He gave Mary a cursory glance before his sharp eyes landed on Charles. "Walker," Seth said coldly, "you'd better not cause any more trouble. Word is you've been skulking around here, and now I find you in Mrs. Whitfield's house. People like you, nobody wants around." Charles lowered his head, gripping the edge of the table hard. Mary turned to Seth, her voice level and calm. "There's no trouble here. He's staying to care for his child." Seth sneered, his voice dropping. "Be careful, Mary. Men like him, they never really stay." Then he left, letting the door slam behind him. The room went quiet again. Charles stood still for a long time, then whispered, almost to himself, "He's right. I don't even know if I can—" Mary cut in, her gaze firm but not cruel. "You don't need to know. You just need to choose to stay." Charles looked at her. Then at the baby in the cradle, its little hand clutching the blanket, its tiny face flushed and peaceful. He exhaled slowly, and for the first time, he stepped forward, leaned down over the cradle. "I'm here," he whispered, his trembling hand resting on the baby's back. "I'm not leaving." Mary stood behind him, watching his back. Quietly, she let out a breath, lighter, steadier than any promise. Outside, the sky was already beginning to clear, the gray breaking apart to reveal a pale, tentative blue. The next morning, the snow began to melt, weak sunlight glinting off frozen eaves, casting a pale light across the street. The town was still quiet, only a few neighbors out, slowly clearing paths, as if winter itself was retreating, one careful step at a time. Mary stood by the window, her hand clutching the edge of her shawl. In the cradle, the baby slept soundly, cheeks rosy, its breathing steady. The fever had broken during the night. Charles lifted the baby into his arms, clumsy but gentle, as though afraid to wake him. He walked slowly to the door, stepping out onto the porch, letting the morning light fall across the child's tiny face. Mary followed and stopped just behind him, her gaze soft and quiet. Charles crouched, letting the baby's little hand touch the icy snow. Then he smiled, a small, honest smile. The baby stirred, eyes fluttering open, its fingers curling tightly around his. Mary felt something warm rise in her chest at the sight. Those endless stormy nights now seemed like a distant memory. He had stayed. He turned to meet her eyes, and his were no longer hollow, no longer lost. There was calm in them now, quiet determination, the kind that only comes from choosing to remain. Mary nodded slightly. She knew then she no longer had to worry he'd vanish. Across the street, Eleanor Briggs peeked through her window, then slowly drew the curtain shut. Tom Briggs stepped out onto his porch, and for the first time, he gave Mary a faint nod. No words, but enough to let her see their eyes had changed. This street would still whisper, still judge, but they no longer looked at her as a foolish woman rescuing a lost man. They saw her as someone who'd saved a child, and its father too. Charles stood, the baby in his arms, and turned back toward Mary. His lips parted like he meant to speak, but instead he simply lowered his head, clutching the child to his chest. Mary stepped down beside him, both of them watching the sky grow steadily bluer. Snow dripped slowly from the roof in small, steady drops. She didn't say anything, just set her hand lightly on his shoulder. He looked at her, eyes wet, and nodded. In the pale morning light, Mary understood. Sometimes being a mother was simply choosing to stay, to hold on to what you hadn't birthed, but knew you had to protect anyway. And she knew for this child, and for its father, she had become the mother they needed. On the third day after the storm, the streets began to fill again. There was a faint hint of spring in the breeze, the snow on the rooftops slowly melting into little streams that trickled down the gutters. Mary stood outside the little house, her hands folded loosely over her apron, watching Charles sit on the steps, the baby sleeping quietly in his arms. He no longer looked like the lost man he'd been on that first night. He sat still, steady, as though he'd finally accepted that his life no longer belonged to the streets but here, on this porch, where his son now slept. Tom Briggs passed by, pausing for a moment to smile and nod at Mary. She nodded back faintly. The town would still whisper behind her back. She knew that. But in the glances of those who passed, she could see something had changed. There was no longer just judgment in their eyes, but also a quiet respect. That afternoon, Charles stood and carried the baby back inside. He laid him gently in the cradle, pulling the blanket up carefully. The child stirred, then settled back into sleep. Charles turned to face Mary, hesitant. "I don't know what to say," he said softly. You didn't have to do any of this, but you did." Mary looked at him, her eyes kind but steady. "Not everyone chooses to stay," she replied. "You did, and so did I." Charles lowered his head, pressing his lips together, hiding feelings he still didn't know how to name. He whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." Mary smiled faintly. "Don't make me regret it, Walker," she said, her voice warm with just a hint of teasing. The little house fell quiet again, just the faint crackle of the fire, the soft wind against the porch, and the even breaths of the baby sleeping in his cradle. Mary sat down, feeling a kind of peace she hadn't felt in years. She'd lived a life full of loss and storms, but on that night when he'd knocked on her door, holding his child and asking for help, she'd known. Sometimes being a mother wasn't about giving birth. Sometimes being a mother was simply choosing to stay, to hold on to the children and the fathers, no one else wanted, and to believe they were worth saving. Mary closed her eyes, letting the quiet warmth settle in her chest, and she knew. She'd done the right thing. Outside, the sky cleared, snow melting, the golden light of evening falling across the street. A new season was coming. And in that little house, a new family had just begun.